learned performer's tricks to train his brain to think about what he needed it to think, and then, wait, needed it to think, when he needed it to think it. Okay, see, this is like confusing. Anyway, he got his brain working. And when he turned those same skills to taming the negative thoughts of his inner critical voice, he realized that he had the power to not only transform his own life, but the lives of others as well. Now he is a certified coach. So, as a certified coach, Paul specializes in helping his clients remove the cloud of doubt, self criticism, and overthinking that prevents them from discovering their true purpose. So, we're excited to have you here tonight, Paul, and clean up our head trash. I added that. That's not official.
I'll use it. Great, thank you. So here I am playing a piece of music that I hadn't played in 5 years when it happened. My mind, it was suddenly filled with thoughts of a girl that I'd had a crush on 5 years earlier. I could feel my heartbeat speeding up and sort of the swirl of emotions that was throwing me off balance. And I was really quite shocked because why was I thinking thoughts from 5 years ago, thoughts that had nothing to do with my life today? Well, it turned out the answer to that question would end up changing my life. You see, after that sort of initial shock of it all wore off, I realized that those old thoughts and emotions returned to my heart and my head at a very specific place in the piece of music that I was playing. Now, back in college, when I was in music school, I was learning that piece of music. It was kind of hard. And there was this little 4-measure section that was particularly difficult, and it just was not getting any better over the days and the weeks that I've been working on it. So what I decided to do was to spend 40 minutes of one practice time on just those 4 measures, playing them over and over and over, hoping that they would become less awkward. Well, all that repetition worked. They did become less awkward. But the interesting thing is that during those same 40 minutes, I was thinking about this girl. And 5 years later, when those thoughts came screaming back to my mind, it hit me. I had practiced those thoughts along with those notes. The thoughts and the emotions had become so attached to the physical activity of playing those notes that all I had to do was play those notes and those old thoughts returned. I thought, well, gee, if that's what happens when you practice thoughts, maybe I should be a little more careful about what thoughts I'm practicing. You know, when I'm making music, maybe things could be a little more beneficial to music making. So over the course of about 30 years, that's one of the things that I got kind of good at, is training my brain, as Becky said, to think what I needed it to think when I needed it to think it. Now fast forward a few more years, and I became aware that there was this voice in my head that was constantly telling me what I could or couldn't do, what I should or shouldn't do. And there were so many messages. It felt like I was just surrounded, kind of hemmed in by all these messages. And I could see that it was beginning to show up in other parts of my life. I mean, my career, it was fine, but it only went sort of so far. My relationships were only so deep. My emotional life was a bit tepid. And I could just tell that I was not achieving and accomplishing all the things that I knew deep inside was really possible for me. Now, we all have this negative voice in our head, which is constantly telling us one thing or another. As I said, mine would say things like, you know, Paul, you're really not quite smart enough or talented enough to do the things that you want to do. Or it would also even say things like, you know, Paul, the emotions that you have and what you think is important, they don't really matter. What other people feel and think, that's more important. And I found myself sometimes feeling sort of just unacceptable the way I was, that somehow I was supposed to be someone different. I would be very curious to know, what are some of the messages that all of you have heard from this little voice? Just go ahead and just shout out something. What is it? So for me, it was, I wasn't smart enough and I'm really not quite acceptable the way I am. You're a shitty golfer. All right, great example. Thank you for sharing that. Anybody else? You're a bad dog mom. Great. Okay. Thank you. Not good enough. In what way? Yeah, great. Pardon me? Oh, yeah, that was a dumb decision. Why did you do that?
So the other piece is like as you're retiring or separating out, right? The expectation that you have to lower your standard to get your foot in the door, right?
Oh,
That you're going to have to take a step backwards.
yeah. Don't let your light shine. Yeah. Great examples. Thank you so much for sharing that. Now, I want you to think back to something I said just a couple of minutes ago, that we all have this little voice in our head. Okay, now, if some of you are thinking, well, no, I don't think I've really got that voice, that's the one that I'm talking about, right there. Now, there are over 8 billion of us on this planet. What would it be like, do you think, if, let's say, maybe a quarter of them, 2 billion, were free of all those negative messages that run around our heads? And let's just say you were one of those 2 billion. What would that be like for you? What would you be free to do, to create, to be? In what way might you be able to soar that you're not soaring today? And what would it be like if everyone were that free? Yeah, how would you feel? I mean, would you feel excited, energized, optimistic? Would you maybe feel empowered to do the things that really matter to you? I think that's how I'd feel. Actually, that is how I frequently feel. And the reason is because I figured out a little way to get that voice in my head, which is constantly arguing for my limitations. I figured out a way to turn it into an ally so that it's telling me things that are supportive and encouraging. Now, my training and experience as both a musician and as a coach helped me develop a method that gets to this point. But before that, when I think about it, as I said, we've all got this voice and we do our best to sort of overcome it. We stumble around looking for that magic bullet that we hope will finally silence this voice. But really, that's the problem. Because we're stumbling around, throwing spaghetti at the wall and hoping something sticks. When what we really need is a process and a method that will get us where we want to go without all the crazy detours. So, as I said, I was able to figure out a method that actually does that. And it does it in a way that takes into consideration your thoughts, your emotions, your body, and your spirit. Now, in a little bit, I'm going to share this method with you and how it works. But I have to be honest with you. I don't quite have time in this hour tonight to get all the details and all the ins and outs of this process. I've actually written a book on this whole topic. I happen to have some here if anybody's interested in looking at them later. But it's what we're going to do is I will let you know about sort of how this process works. And the other thing is this process is fairly simple and straightforward, but I've got a couple of opportunities for you. One I will mention at the end. If you find this information interesting, there is a way to continue having a conversation about this. But right now, if you're thinking maybe I should be taking notes, if you want, I have taken notes for you. And if you would like a copy of those notes, whoops, where do we get here? If you would like a copy of those notes, you could scan that QR code and download them immediately. You will also get an email with a link to those notes so that when you get home to your computer, if you'd rather have it there than on your phone, you can do that. So the first phase, if we're going to be talking about how do we reprogram our thoughts, it seems like one of the important places to start is getting really clear on what thoughts actually are. So thoughts, really, they are just electrochemical signals that our brain cells use to communicate with each other. Our senses, they take in information from the world around us in all various forms of vibration, whether it's vibration of light waves or sound waves. And then they pass this information on to the neurons in our brain, which confer with each other. And they compare these incoming signals with things that they've seen in the past. And they try to figure out what's happening. Our brain does not see. Our brain does not hear. It just looks at the incoming data and it makes its best guess as to what's going on. Now, very often those conclusions it comes to are pretty helpful. They serve us well. They help us navigate through life. But when those conclusions are off, this is when it begins causing us some troubles. Maybe we find ourselves feeling confused, or maybe lacking some confidence, or maybe we even find ourselves things like procrastinating or tolerating things we just don't need to tolerate. The conclusions that our brain comes to show up in very real and concrete ways in our lives. And these conclusions, these negative self-talk conclusions, are really just thoughts that we've had that we have turned into a habit. We thought them so often. They've just become a habit. And that really is the first phase of this process, is to recognize that all the negative self-talk, all these inner critic messages that we hear, they're just thoughts which have become a habit. They're not who you are. They don't define you, unless, of course, you say they do. They're just thoughts. They're just electrochemical signals in your brain. And just this realization alone, that can relieve a lot of the pressure that we experience when it comes to these inner critic messages. I'll tell you a story about one of my clients. He came to me with a lot of really heavy negative thoughts in his mind. And it was showing up in very, very real ways. He had this sort of constant anxiety in him. He was looking for a new job, and he had gotten to the place where he had an interview, and then these thoughts came up as he was preparing for this interview. And they were tearing him down so much, he thought, I can't even show up to this interview in a way that's going to make any sense. He withdrew his name from consideration. That's a pretty big effect. Now, we don't all necessarily react this way. But when we were talking, and he came to realize that all these thoughts that were going through his mind were just thoughts, that it's not who he was, he felt a huge sense of relief that it wasn't defining him. When we talked the next week, he said, I've still got a lot of negative thoughts going through my brain, but when they come, I remind myself that these are just thoughts and they're not who I am. And he said that lightened the load so much. So even this first phase can have a big effect. Okay, so, the second phase of this is to uncover the lies that these messages have been telling us. I have yet to encounter an inner critic message which isn't ultimately based on a lie. Oh, these lies, they come with plenty of evidence. They come with plenty of reasons and justification for why you should believe them. They tend to be pretty loud, pretty in your face, pretty hard to ignore. And frankly, that's the biggest clue. Because when somebody's trying to convince you of something, what do? They lay out all the reasons you should believe what they want you to believe. They dredge up all sorts of evidence to prove to you that what they're telling you is the truth. They will justify why you should believe what they want you to believe, and they will rationalize away any weakness in their argument, and they will talk and talk and talk until you're blue in the face. They will talk until you give in. They can be relentless. But why do they work so hard? Well, I think they work so hard because what they're trying to convince you of isn't actually true. I mean, how does truth convince us? It doesn't. It's just there for us to recognize. It doesn't try to convince anybody of anything. It just is. And we're completely free to believe it or not. And recognizing the truth, this tends to be a pretty quiet affair. Truth speaks to that still small voice within. It asks us to be open and receptive to the world. And when we find ourselves sort of filled with distraction or energy or noise and activity, it can be pretty difficult to hear what truth is trying to tell us. So this second phase in this process is to just clear away everything that's not true, so that what is true can begin to shine through. And when this happens, this is when you get to the core of the beliefs you have that are holding you back. Now, there are a number of different ways that we can clear away some of those lies, but I have one little exercise that we can do together tonight to at least help you get started on this process for yourself. I will pass out some sheets here, and I have some pens for those who don't have. We have pens. I have pens. You have pens. You guys are prepared. You don't have a pen? Any more sheets? Anybody missing a sheet or a pen? So, thank you for the help in passing those out. So what I would like you to do is think about some area of your life. I don't know whether it's work or relationships or something in your life where you're kind of aware that you've got these messages that are holding you back, something that just doesn't feel right, that you're not achieving what you know you can. And then under number one, I would like you to list all those messages that you can think of that this little voice in your head tells you about that. What did your particular voice say? Just list as many as you can think of. And let me say, you won't be asked to share anything that you're writing down, so it's private, and the more honest you can be, the more helpful this will be. And for those of you who are really fast, you could move on to the second one and take a look at all the messages you just wrote down under number one. And see if you can find some sort of little common theme or common thread that seems to wind through all of them. And then you can put that down under number two. And if you're having trouble finding out what that thread or that theme is, let me know. I'm happy to help. But usually there's some underlying common thread that you can find that ties them all together. Anybody struggling to find a common theme and would like some help, that is? Yes, sir. Anyone else like a little help along the way? Okay. Well, then if you take a look at the third question there, what are the benefits of believing that? Now, most people are going to say, there aren't too many benefits to these negative messages. But I can tell you, if they have become a habit, if you keep thinking them over and over, there's a reason for it. You're getting something out of it. Now, sometimes we might say, well, let's see, all these messages say this, and since I am that way, notice that's one of the lies, you're not that way, but here are some habits. Since I am that way, I am now absolved of responsibility for something different. If I'm not smart enough to do something, well, it's not my problem that I didn't get A's in school. I mean, this is just the way it is. So we're absolved of responsibility. That's a really, really common benefit that we experience. So just think about what are the various ways that you might be getting some sort of benefit, relieving of some pressure, or allowing something to be that you don't have to change, you don't have to work on. It's like, oh, phew. Because when we're aware of the benefits and the payoffs for a certain belief, then we get a little bit of clarity about what's really going on and whether that benefit is worth the next question, which are the costs to believing that message. Because you don't have to change any of these messages if you don't want, if they're serving you in ways that you're happy with. But when you're aware of both the costs and the benefits, sort of what the underlying message is, then you have a choice to make. And just making a choice puts you in a position of agency and power. You don't become a victim to those habitual thoughts. Now, there's another idea that I want to share with you. There are two big fears or roadblocks that tend to keep us stuck, that keep us from really making real changes. The first one is a fear of being unworthy, that we're not good enough, which is oftentimes one of the base parts of these messages. I'm just not good enough. And what's interesting about this is that this is actually a lie that is pretending to be true. Because we do all sorts of things to try to prove to ourselves and to others that, yes, I really am worthy. Perfectionism is a beautiful example of this. No, this has to be absolutely perfect before I can bring this out into the world. There's this sense that, I'm not good enough. I have to prove to myself that I'm good enough for this. And when I talk to my clients about this, and I say, we're all just inherently worthy. There's nothing to prove. Sometimes I can see the looks on their faces like, I'm not sure that fits in my head very well. So then I ask them two questions. I say, so think of an infant. What do? They eat, sleep, that other thing, Are they worthy? What do you think? Infants, are they worthy? Okay, I see some heads nodding. So far, I haven't run into anyone who said, no, they're not worth much yet. Think also of, let's say, a person in their 90s. who has end-stage Alzheimer's, who doesn't remember you, doesn't remember their own name, can't even feed themselves. Are they worthy? I also see heads nodding already. Yeah, I've not met anyone, again, who says, no, they're not. We recognize that there's this inherent worth simply because they're here. There's nothing they have to do to prove their worth. They just are worthy. It's the same with all of us at all stages of our life. We're just worthy because we're here. That's enough. Babies don't worry about, oh, I have to prove myself to mom and dad, or otherwise they're not going to feed me. No, they just go on with their day, you know? They have nothing to prove. They just are. The truth is, it's the same for us. But this fear, this little roadblock, it is this lie, but it pretends to be true. That's why it's hard to get past it, because sometimes we don't see that it's a lie. Now, the other fear, the other roadblock is, excuse me, believe it or not, a fear of death. Now, this may sound a bit overly dramatic, but I will say that overly dramatic quality is its superpower. Because if we're coming across some change we're thinking about making, if the fear is really big and really powerful, it can keep us from changing. Okay? But if then our prefrontal cortex gets involved in the things, you know, it's not going to kill me. I'm not going to die if XYZ happens. You know, that's just crazy. We're good. We're good, right? We could just go on. And nothing changes. When the truth is here that if something is going to change in your life, something does need to die. Not you, but some way in which you identify yourself. Some way in which you see yourself has to give way to a new way of seeing yourself if you're going to show up differently in life. So this one, this fear of death, it pretends to be a lie, but it's true. So there's some aspect of us which we have to be willing to release if we're going to make some changes. So the last question on this worksheet is about that. How do those two fears, the fear of worthiness and the fear of death, how does this play into all those other answers that you've made, particularly on that second one? How did they relate to that big meta message you wrote under number 2? Or how do they relate to 3 and 4? I did the same exercise with a group this past weekend. And there was one woman who afterwards said, you know, when you said fear of death is a little overly dramatic, I thought, yeah, that's a little overly dramatic, you know, that's kind of crazy. But then when she got thinking about it, she realized, oh yeah, there is actually some way in which she saw herself that did need to go away if something was going to happen. And it ended up being kind of a big release for her. It's like, oh, there was a clear path ahead for her now. So it's a pretty powerful question to think about. If you're wanting a change, what are you willing to let go of in you to allow that change to happen? So, as I said, there are a number of different ways we can uncover the truth by pushing away everything that's not alive. This is one of them. There's a few other ways listed in my book. But okay, once we've done that, then what? Well, then we get to the, well, shall we say, more fun part of the process. The third part is to create a new message. What is it that you want this little voice in your head to be telling you? What belief do you want to create? Now, this is basically creating an affirmation. Some of you may love affirmations. Some of you may have tried them and said, you know, I find them kind of useless. They're pretty ineffective and a waste of time. If you happen to fall into that second category, I am willing to wager that regardless of how powerful any particular affirmation was that you were using, it wasn't quite the right one for you at that time. You know, we all have very custom created self-doubts. And if we're going to overcome them, we need custom designed solutions to do that. Solutions that speak directly to the lies that you began uncovering, that speak to them in a way that stripped them of their power, and that speak to you in a way that supports and encourages you. That's really what this third phase is about, is coming up with a message that allows you to really begin to live into what is true. Yeah? It's about creating that custom designed affirmation, message, belief that suits you and your circumstance. Yeah? I'm curious, what so far, when this exercise that we did, what was that experience like for you? As I said, I'm not asking you to tell me what are your answers, but just what was the experience of doing that like? Pretty refreshing, you said? Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. I don't know if you know the name Pema Chodron, but she said, when we feel fear, that means that the truth is nearby, you know? And there's this idea that she also talks about when we're feeling fear, that's the direction to run in. Because that's where the truth is, that's where the growth is happening. You run away from it, it's going to control you quite a bit. Any other reactions to just what that experience was like for you? Yes, absolutely. Putting words to it to describe what's going on helps clarify what's really going on, the stuff that's sort of going on in the back of our minds that maybe we're not paying a lot of attention to. We bring it up to the front, and all of a sudden there's a lot more clarity about it. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. Anybody else?
I think also valid for some are done work on this that needs are to be revisited and realizing that play that work. So like sometimes you just go again and bring yourself back to that.
Yes. Thank you so much for mentioning that. Because that's absolutely true. This is a process that I take myself through over and over because there's always another layer of growth that I can experience. Now, anybody on this side want to share anything? I've noticed everybody who's talked is on that side of the aisle. Yes, sir.
I guess I'm kind of came out a little bit
Okay.
just because I usually look at myself.
Sure. Okay, yeah. So I was a little confused about fears because he was using them to motivate himself. Fear can be a fabulous motivator. It is really, really powerful because, well, it's interesting. Actually, when most people talk about motivation, how do I find the motivation to do whatever it is they're wanting to do? Usually, it is a fear-based motivation, meaning that there's something here that they're wanting to avoid. And so I'm going to go this way so I don't experience that. That's a fear-based motivation. And it's really, really powerful. This is what causes people to jump out the window of a burning building. That is a powerful, powerful motivator. It's generally not very sustainable because it takes a lot of effort, because you're always pushing against something. And this is one of the other really interesting things about this process, particularly this third one of creating a new message, because we want to speak to those lies in some way, but we don't want to fight against them, because fighting them will only strengthen them. And we know this from three different sciences. We know it from physics, we know it from psychology, and we know it from metaphysics. Physics, Isaac Newton, Third law of motion, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. What you push against pushes against you. Okay, interesting to know. Psychology, Carl Jung, probably most famous for saying, what you resist not only persists, but grows in size. We don't usually hear that last part of it, but that's the rest of the quote. That to me sounds a lot like Isaac Newton. Jung was talking about what he called the shadow, aspects of ourself that we don't really want to acknowledge. No, I'm not a cruel person. I don't have a cruel bone in my body. Well, if you're human, you have a lot of different bones in your body. And he says if you ignore that, it stays with you and actually grows in strength and starts affecting your life. Okay, this sounds just like Newton to me. Metaphysics, law of attraction, which says that energy tends to attract similar energy to it. So if you have an energy of opposition, you're going to find more to oppose. I feel like all three of these say exactly the same thing. So when you're creating this new message, you don't want to be arguing with the old one, because that's just fighting against it. That's why we want to get to the root of the lie, why we want to find out what's really at the bottom, so we can talk about that rather than the symptom on the top. Yeah? It's not about whether, I don't know, you're a shitty golfer or a bad dog mom or whatever it is. That's not really at the core. So if my friend over there was to say, actually, I'm a great dog mom, this is kind of fighting against the idea that I'm not. And that fighting against will just strengthen that message. We need to figure out a way around it and a little end run around it. That's what I mean by creating a custom message that suits you and your situation, that really gets to the bottom of things. Any other thoughts or comments about any of this? Especially from this side? Yes?
Doing the exercise, it reminds me of the saying that Bill heard. It's like, you're your own critic, right? So whether you cook a meal and everybody else looks great, you're like, oh, I put too much salt in it, or if you play some music and you're like, oh, I made a mistake on that part, nobody heard it, right?
Yeah.
We always are more conscious of our mistakes. I think that's kind of that voice too, like it's never good.
Exactly. Yes, that's exactly it. That voice is, it loves to hold up a measuring stick to us, and I can guarantee you, you will never measure up. From that point of view, you will never measure up. So we have to talk about something else. We have to work our way around that. The energy behind these negative messages, its intention is to keep you safe, to keep you alive. A good intention, And the other things we know from physics is that you can't create or destroy energy, you can just transform it. So we're not trying to jettison the energy that brings up these old negative messages. We want to transform them into ones that help us. So we want to befriend whatever is going on underneath that message. That's a lot of the work that I do with my clients. Like, so what's going on underneath? What is the real message? What are you really afraid of? And not always, but often it comes down to something that they experienced in childhood. There's another client. Yeah, I've got time for this, I think. She had trouble talking to groups. She felt sort of uncomfortable doing that, really shy, and she just wasn't showing up in her full, beautiful self doing that. And what we learned through conversation is that as she was growing up, she was one of, I don't know, was it 8 kids or something like that, and one of the younger ones. And she loved to perform and to do things. But of course, she was the young one, and she could never be as smart or as good or as whatever as her older siblings. And there was one older sibling in particular, which would always kind of humiliate her when she would do stuff. She was about 8 when she was experiencing this. And she realized that was the part of her that was trying to keep her safe by saying, don't speak to groups, because you don't want to be humiliated again. Well, in a little more conversation, we discovered that this little 8-year-old part of her was really fun and had lots of sort of playful energy. And the adult thought, I would love to have fun and playful, fun energy when I'm speaking to groups. I mean, that would be way more powerful. And so in really uncovering this, we were able to get the two of them, shall we say, to work together. So we didn't get rid of that little 8-year-old. We just turned her energies around in a new way. So that's another sort of example of making that custom designed solution. Okay, so once you got this message, then what? Well, then we take a little page out of my experience as a musician. We say, you got to practice it. I mean, this is what I was doing for those 40 minutes back in college. I was thinking the same thoughts over and over. Those thoughts and feelings had become just as ingrained and as automatic as the notes that I was learning to play. Now, I also learned some tricks and some techniques to make practice really effective and long-lasting. And although that's important, what's really important is to realize that this step of practicing, this is where the rubber meets the road. You can do those other 3 phases flawlessly, but if you don't practice your new message, nothing's going to change. All your tomorrows, they're going to be pretty much like all your yesterdays. Okay, well, how do I know if I practice this message, it really is going to program my mind? Well, this is exactly what the inner critic has been doing for you for years. It's been telling you the same stories over and over and over. Now, maybe its messages are more condemnation than affirmation, but the process is the same. What you think repeatedly becomes your belief. Okay? So practicing this is really key. Now, I will also give you a little bonus piece of information about how to practice and when to practice. Don't wait until you are bombarded by negative messages from your head to start practicing a new one. That's a little like saying, okay, I'm going to go to the gym and I'm going to start lifting weights and I'm going to start with 200 pounds. It ain't going to work, you know? You practice this new message when you're already feeling pretty good, because you need to strengthen that muscle. And the more you practice it, the more automatic it becomes. And eventually, it not only becomes your belief, but it becomes strong enough to withstand the pressure from those negative messages. Most people will tend to wait. Well, most people, frankly, won't practice. They just turn back and say, oh, okay, good. I've learned all this. I'm good now. And that's okay. But if they're wanting something to change in their life, it's not going to. So this practicing is really important. And the other thing I will say, I'll let you in on a hint. So those thoughts that came back to me after 5 years, if I'm going to be honest with you, they came back for decades. Every time I played that piece, I get to those 4 measures and those thoughts returned. For decades, after only 40 minutes of practice. Why was that habit so strongly created? Is it because the thoughts I was having were emotionally charged? Frankly, those thoughts were not about love. They were about my lovability. How lovable am I? This cuts pretty deeply to the soul, you know? And so there I was doing the same physical motions over and over and over, having really so much, basically the same thoughts over and over and over, and they were emotionally charged. That creates a really powerful habit. And that is why we want to get to the bottom, number 2, bottom of the lies, why we want to create a custom designed message that really makes your heart sing. When you create this message, you come up with something, and then you say it to yourself. You read through it. You say, is there a word in here which feels kind of off? Is there something kind of weak about it? Okay, well, let's redraft that, rewrite it, come up with something a little bit stronger. Replace that word, replace that phrase. And what you're looking for when you're creating that message is at least a feeling of relief. Some of the weight and the heaviness of those inner critic messages was just let go of with this message. So that's a great sign that you're on the right track. Ideally, what you'd like is inspiration. And I just realized that when I said that word, I didn't finish this other conversation. Remember we talked about motivation and fear-based motivation, how strong it is, but it's not very sustainable? If you find inspiration, meaning that's where I want to go, that will pull you towards it. And when it's really emotionally charged and you're excited, that's all you want to do. And whatever roadblocks and hurdles that come up doesn't matter so much, because that inspiration will pull you over it and you're not pushing against things. So you end up gaining an energy rather than being drained of it. Does that make sense? Yeah. So this practicing is really what's important. Now, you've all come here for probably a lot of different reasons tonight, but my guess is there's some of you here who are here to network, to meet some people, to find some support in finding new work, to figure out how do I transition back from my life in the military to this civilian life. And when you think about interviewing or meeting new people, how often has that voice in your head said things that, well, made you feel a little awkward or inadequate? And how does that show up then when you're interviewing, or even when you're just writing out your resume? If you're feeling bad about it, what's that resume going to look like? What would be different for you if instead this voice was encouraging, if it helped you show up more authentically, and it made you feel like $1,000,000? What difference would that make in everything you do? Well, there is a way to make that happen, and it is not throwing spaghetti at the wall. This method that I have outlined for you today can reprogram your thoughts. My clients and I have seen this happen over and over again. It is a very powerful process, and it's a process which does what it does without all those detours. It gets you where you want to go quicker and more powerfully. Now, if you have found what I've shared tonight interesting, and you are tired of living with some of the messages you've been living with, if you're interested in continuing this conversation, there's a way to do that. And again, if you wanted to take out your phone and scan this QR code, if you do that, this QR code also happens to be on the back side of the worksheet. If you do that, what you would be able to do would be to schedule a one-on-one consultation with me, no charge, no obligation for anything. And we can talk a little bit about these messages and what's happening in your life. And we can also see if working together to really implement this method to change the way you think is right for you at the moment. It's not going to be right for everybody. It's got to be at the right time. But if this is you and you're thinking, I'm so tired of this voice, and I see how it holds me back at work, my relationships, the way I relate to my dog, I don't know, in all sorts of ways. If that's you and you're ready to change that, I would encourage you to go ahead and sign up for one of those sessions. They can be pretty powerful. That is the information that I have to share with you tonight. If I'm not mistaken, we have a few minutes left yet for questions or comments, and I would love to continue this conversation. Thank you so much, first of all, for the invitation to be here. Thank you for your attention, your engagement, what you shared. I've enjoyed this very much, and I hope we can continue this conversation now, because I would like to get to know all of you a little bit better. I know some of you are golfers and some of you have dogs, but I don't know too much more, Yeah.